Kia ora koutou, mihi ana kia koutou tēnei ahiahi. Nā mahara mai ki tēnei o ngā Whāki webinars mō Poutū-te-rangi. Nei rā te mihi ki ngā manuhiri, ngā kai kōrero, tai mai te eco-index, o tira koutou katoa. Look, just want to say welcome to everyone today. For this, the March version of the Whāki webinar. We're really great to have both Catherine Kirby and Corey Ruha joining us from Eco-Index to really just talk about the work that project's been doing as a part of New Zealand's Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, working towards reversing the decline of native biodiversity. I think one of the reasons we were particularly interested in hearing about them in the context of the Whāki webinars is it's a really data-driven project, and they've been doing work with digital dashboards, thinking about AI tools, and also giving some consideration to what Māori Data Sovereignty looks like in the context of their project. So, hoping to hear about that through this afternoon's webinar. So, Catherine's the Communication and Relationships Manager for Eco-Index, and Corey is part of the data science team and also the liaison with Aotearoa. So really looking forward to hearing from them. There's some sort of background information I think that they're going to provide, so we're all up to speed with what's happening in terms of Eco-Index, and then some more kind of general discussion notes about their thinking in relation to Māori Data Sovereignty, and happy for people to engage in just the conversations and questions and answers at the back end of the presentations as well. So kia ora kōrua, o tira koutou katoa. Over to you, Catherine.
Kia ora Maui, and kia ora everybody. Corey's here with me too. He'll be joining for the second half of this presentation. I'm just going to start with an introduction. So let's see if the slides will share. How's that for everybody? Kapai? Okay, so tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou i tēnei wā. It's a pleasure to be speaking today. We're, as Maui said, presenting an open discussion on our approach to environmental wellbeing, and we'll be kicking that off with an introduction. So, ko waio no uropi oku tipuna, ko Brian toku whānau no ohiwa aho, kei kirikiri roa tuku kainga i nai nei, ko Catherine Kirby toku ingoa. It's a pleasure to be speaking today as the Communication and Relationships Manager for Eco-Index. I'm an ecologist, science communicator, and all-round ngāhere advocate based in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton. So I'll jump in. It might be a bit of a whirlwind tour, but let's have some questions after my slides, or we'll hold maybe any really juicy ones till the end. So the Eco-Index program is part of New Zealand's Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, Ngā Koeoro Tuku Iho, and our team is made up of a diverse skill set with people from all over the motu, and we've been running since 2020 and funded through to 2024. Collaboration is central to our kaupapa, so I'm going to start us off with an overview of our work streams, and we're going to dive straight into our proof of concept partnerships. This is really important for us as we develop new science to provide information and tools for those who want to benefit biodiversity on their land. And we've got lots of new ideas that we need to prove with our partners. So these are some of the groups who we're testing our concepts with, including Te Ranga o Kia with Te Aroa Climate Change Working Group, who Corey is working very closely with. And there's a few others who we're not quite at the stage of popping logos up, but who are enthusiastically on board. So where did we start? We needed to start with a long-term vision, and we looked at the visions, mission statements, goals, and conservation-related aims from groups, iwi, councils, community groups, industry entities from across Aotearoa, and analysed what is everyone heading towards. We found that to be a bit technocratic and vague, so we developed a bit further to create a national biodiversity vision. And we call that vision Protected, Restored, Connected by 2121. I'm going to work through each of those elements, and then we're going to drill down a bit deeper into the restore part. So protect tiaki, that's all about considering the native ecosystems that we have in place right now and what their current and future threats are, and protecting those ecosystems. Restore whakahau is focused on representation. So for each catchment across the country, we're seeking for restoration of the original ecosystems up to 15% of the area that they used to cover. So that addresses the fact that we have unequal disruption and clearance of our ecosystems. We have a lot more representation on the maunga, for example, than the lowlands. So I'm going to dig a bit more deeper into that soon. Connect tūhono. This is an element that we're still working on, but it's all about reconnecting the native ecosystems from mountains to the sea, and also the people involved in those ecosystems or linked to them. And the 21-21 long-term vision is just to acknowledge that it's going to take a long time to get everybody on board, to take incremental steps together to achieve long-term change. And it gives us time to get started now, but also to make iterative changes along the way, take steps towards this long-term vision. So let's jump into restore a little bit more. We have set biodiversity targets for every catchment across the country, and they're based on this generalized species area curve, which has been developed from observations of the pattern of environmental degradation from ecosystems across the world, including New Zealand. And this curve shows that as the original extent of our habitat area declines from 100% of its original area, then we lose species. That seems kind of obvious, but what we've found through these observational studies is that when we get below around 20%, in that 10 to 20% zone, the species decline rapidly increases, and that ecosystem is no longer self-sustaining, no longer functional, no longer resilient. So we've decided that in a stepwise process, let's try and aim for 15% of the original extent of each ecosystem, whether it be kahikatea forest, freshwater, wetlands, alpine herb fields, whatever you're working with. Let's try and get all of them back up to this threshold of 15% to try and stabilize our ecosystems and protect native biodiversity from further decline. It's also important to note that this is a minimum target, so it doesn't mean that in some catchments when you have 40% that it's okay to clear down to 15%. The 40% needs to be protected, restored, and connected as well. So what does that look like across Aotearoa? This graph is a first cut and has a little bit of refinement to be done. But if we look at these different ecosystem types along the x-axis, we can see that it's this group who are below the 15% target. We also will very soon split out this wetland group to include freshwater and saline, and we'll see definitely that they're both below 15% as well. And if we think about our country on a landscape and topographic basis, these graph lines pretty much match the topography of the country because we cleared the lowlands for many logical reasons, but this is where we need to do the most work to ensure that the native biodiversity in those lowland ecosystems is safe and thriving. So what might this look like? These slides are mock-ups, but say if this is Whangaroa Harbour in Raglan, if this is what pre-human ecosystem extent looked like, and this is what current ecosystem extent looked like with these different ecosystem types, our recommendations could look something like this, with these hatched areas as suggested places for ecological restoration to get those lowland ecosystems back up to 15%, connect our ecosystems from mountains to the sea, and ensure that key ecosystems are not left out. So that is our proof of concepts, our vision, and our targets. We're also developing some new tools to inform this work, and they include some new biodiversity remote sensing tools. So using artificial intelligence and machine learning, we are working towards being able to pick up ecological restoration on the ground through satellite imagery. So again, a mock-up of the idea. This is based on the Pōkai Whenua catchment in Waikato, but we're training machines, artificial intelligence, using artificial intelligence to detect change in the ecosystem layers over time so that we can actually quantify what's being done. So we could say in this catchment, without having to send an ecologist or a team of ecologists out onto the land in every single catchment regularly, we can do it remotely to see that as this restoration is occurring around this gully, it's all picked up remotely and automatically to provide us information about how much effort's been put in, that can be converted into how many dollars have been invested, and help to inform where more restoration's needed, how much is being done, and help with funding bids, with auditing, with reporting, just adding to the information available in this space. So then on to restoration investments. Once we know how much is going on, we can understand the investment that's been made. So in order to work out how much it actually costs to undertake ecological restoration, we're aggregating data from the likes of DOC, Jobs for Nature, regional councils, community groups, and lots of others. And that's allowing the quantification of the average restoration costs for different ecosystems across different land use classes, but also across the country, because it costs very different amounts to restore something, to restore a lowland ecosystem in Northland compared to Southland, for example. And then how much will it cost to meet our 15% targets for each catchment, region, industry, iwi, nationally? We can cut the cookie in lots of different ways to provide the most relevant information for people who are trying to do this on the whenua. And then what does that look like per annum? If this is between now and 21, we can break it down to annual investments, and that will help with financial planning for all different types of land management. And then finally, I know that's a whirlwind, but I'm happy to answer questions. We have an aggregated eco-index score. So with this information that we're gathering, data about how much effort's going in and all of these different indicators, again, this is a work in progress, but if we pick up or we're provided data from lots of different sources, which we are gathering into our own custom built database, we can actually check out how they fit within each element of our vision. So if this is our vision through Protect, Restore, Connect, we can gauge and measure how we're doing by each of these indicators. And this is an approach developed by the Society for Ecological Restoration and has been adopted across the world to give us some way of quantifying and tracking progress over time. So imagine if we're just focusing on Protect, these might be our indicators, and we can rate them from 1 to 5 and then add those up. So say we get a score of 9 out of 15 for Protect, 9 out of 25 for Restore, and 10 out of 10 for Connect. It gives you an overall eco-index score for whatever area you're looking at. Perhaps it's for the country, for one region, for one rohi, whatever you decide. And that can be used to track progress over time, which again can be useful in reporting and funding bids and just understanding in one figure how you're doing in terms of native biodiversity. This is something that we'll be working on in the next year, and you can keep an eye on our progress through our newsletter or social media or whatever you prefer. So that's the whirlwind tour. Are there any questions at this point? I'm very happy to answer them, and I've also got some of my colleagues on the call here who can help me out. Otherwise, we can hand over to Corey. Excellent.
Ka pai. Kia ora tātou. Tuatahi nei rā te mihi ki a koe Maui I whakatūwhiri tēnei hui I tēnei whakatopu mō te rā nei. Kātahi anō e mihi atu nei ki a koutou te kotahi I karanga mai ki a maua mō tēnei wā ki te whakaaria I o mātou I a mātou mahi. E mihi atu nei hoki ki a koe Catherine he rawa ki te kite I a koe I me te whakaaria I tēnei kaupapa, whakaherehera mō te taia. Nā reira, kia ora tātou. Yeah, so Māori Data Sovereignty. This is the exact type of crew that I would love to be able to explore this kaupapa with. And yeah, I'm hopeful that we might be able to have, I guess, a free-flowing dialogue of sorts, so that if anyone ever feels like they would like to contribute something, or has an idea, or any whakaaro that come through, or any kōrero, please feel free to stop me at any point, as I'd like this to be more of a kōrerorero, and sort of to whakawhiti and to bring together any sort of feedback that, or any sort of ideas that come through. So I'd feel free to jump in at any point. Do I have control of the slides, Catherine? Oh, you do. Kapwai. Could we go to the next slide, please? So as I've gone through these slides, I've chucked in basically all of the places that I connect to. So the slide before was Tarawera. So this one is Pairoa Maunga. So ko waio, so who am I? Ko Pairoa te maunga, ko waikato te awa, ko Ruha te tangata, he uri tēnei, he uri whakaheke no te aroa, tainui mā tātua waka, he uri whakatupu no ahitereiria, Corey Ruha tōku ingoa. So I am a Ruha, and 99% of the time I get asked if I'm from Te Whānau Apanui. Yes, I am, but not through my Ruha side. Our name comes from Pairoa Maunga, which is right by Reperoa, between Rotorua and Taupo. And yeah, we are the Ruha syndicate over in Te Aroa. Kia ora. I'm working with Eco Index as a data scientist, which is, I think, a very generous term, just because I am growing in that space, and I've learned so much from this amazing team, and I very much aspire to empower our people with those skills in data management, data analysis, and I'm undertaking that journey myself, and I've been given that opportunity to do so in the tile space with this awesome team of Eco Index. So kia ora. Next slide, please, Catherine. So for Māori Data Sovereignty, I think I'd like to express what this means to me. For us as a team, we are still having to wānanga through this process, and we're hoping that this type of engagement and these opportunities to present will be able to help shape our thinking around that, because as many people as I talk to in these spaces, many people are still growing. But for me, what is it? It's about whānau and hapu being able to codify their own data in their own context, any sort of data. And by codify, I'm talking about any raw data or any developed data that's about us or our whakapapa. That could be the tile, that could be any connections that we have. We're able to take that data on, strip it back to its raw forms, develop it, analyze it, and output this however we see fit. And then we would be able to shape those outputs, and only we can codify it into such an output. So only, the owners of this data, whether at any scale, whānau or individual, whānau, hapu, iwi, or pan-iwi for some Māori entities, would have the ability to codify it. And then any of these outputs would have that same strength as crown-based outputs. And that would be in alignment with our mana motuhake and our rights in a treaty partnership, treaty partnership. Next slide, please. And so some of the whakaaro, some of the thoughts that our team have shared is, as far as the team's concerned, sovereignty of the data, wherever this data is gifted from, it sits with individual groups, including catchment care groups, so landowners, as well as Māori. at any scale. And so, you know, we're looking at so many different types of data, potentially as well, you know, not just quantitative, but also qualitative. And we'd like to better understand whether it's appropriate to integrate, you know, any of that data, whether if it is qualitative data, or if it is quantitative data, if it is mātauranga Māori within the context of this project. Understanding that it is, you know, it's looking at a national approach. You know, there is an understanding that Māori data is modeled differently, and that's, you know, when we go back to codifying that, if it's coded by iwi, by hapu, by whānau, is it up to us to be able to integrate that into the system if we are gifted this data? And if we do create that space for Māori data, you know, how would that look? You know, if it came into the form of a waiata or mōtete or pūrako, you know, how would that look on a platform like ours? Next slide, please. And it does have its risks and limitations. So our whānau, you know, we need to be invested in. So, you know, at that, I guess it would have to start at a larger scale, just because of resourcing issues for so many different kaupapa. But the fact is that our people need to be able to be resourced to understand what the issues are, and then also upskilled so that we have the capability and capacity to take these on, to be able to codify our own data. And, you know, there's always the risk of Crown and councils taking these outputs. You know, say we say, for example, hey, look at this catchment. Here's the best places to restore it. It's going to cost this much. We don't want Crown or council to just take that and go, sweet, we've got this, we're going to run with it. We want them to always be able to take this and also have Māori have this, and so that they can shape it in their own way, because they might say, yes, we agree with this, or it might be completely different for them. You know, we need them to be able to overlay their own values and principles on top of these layers so that they have their say working alongside Crown and Council. And for Eco Index, yeah, we'll try to apply from our context. I can only speak from the context of Te Urunga o Care, the Te Aotearoa Climate Change Working Group, who I am a part of, and I will speak to our values, and we will try to establish a working product for us, and hopefully it can be taken in some sort of template form, and any other interested parties would be able to implement something like that. So yeah, we're still trying to wānanga how this really looks for us and going outwards towards the rest of the motu. Next one, please. So from me, these are some questions that I have, and just some of my thinking around some of these questions that I asked our team and myself. So, you know, where should Māori data be housed? Of course, we would ideally have it be stored locally, onshore. Catalyst cloud is what I've heard is an option. I think by 2024, they're hoping to build an onshore Amazon Web Services facility here to be able to take on data and store it in Auckland. We need to ensure that that infrastructure is sound and security tight. And we also need to be aware of what policies and legislations with regard to data are going to be won't accept that there's going to be harm caused by any sort of policies and legislation. I'm just over that, where I want to actively look for how is this going to benefit us. You know, it's about protective mechanisms, but we need to be aware of that as a risk as well. What rights do Māori have to provide and remove data? So, you know, Māori own any data they choose to share. We would hope that anything that is shared is gifted from them, and that in that sharing, it would be in agreement with their tikanga that is for them to share. So they have to have that hui and that wānanga within themselves to be able to say, okay, this is something that we would like to share outwards. But, you know, this is a platform and a system. It is what it is. And, you know, if it's at a national scale, we're not sure how to adapt tikanga for everyone. So I feel it's more appropriate that people should just make the decision whether it's for them to share outwards or not, depending on their tikanga and assessing what the tikanga of this platform is and is set to be. So yeah, and any sort of agreements and alignment with tikanga should happen at that whānau and hapu scale. If hapu own the data or whānau own the data, but iwi are holding it, that's something that they need to sort out within themselves and ensure that that tikanga is adhered to. If an iwi entity is the storage place for hapu or whānau data. Next one, please. So who administrates the data? So I think that we need to ensure that we are pono to the fact that data is taonga, and we have to handle it at the highest standard possible. You know, it's not just for it's not an internship job. You know, this is not just, you know, not saying that interns aren't important or they don't get important mahi, but you know, we need to handle this with care and with professionalism. And it's ideal that if we can have this data handled at as close to the bearers and the owners of that data as possible, and that, you know, whoever's handling that data are nominated and trusted people. What happens if there are discrepancies with the data? So in that sense, you know, there needs to be a process of handling any shared data, and, you know, where we might permit some censorship to this data if something needs to be figured out. So if something's shared that shouldn't have been shared, then okay, sweet, well, we will censor this, you know, let you guys know, you know, get in contact with the people who did share it with us, tell them, hey, there's an issue here, and then you guys can sort that out. Next one, please. Who authenticates data? This is a tricky one, I think. So, you know, this also needs to go back at that scale of where's the data come from. It needs to go back to the owners of the data, and it needs to be within their own rohe. So we're working with a lot of public data that's coming through, publicly available data, and working with, you know, companies or operations that have access to sensors and satellites, but, you know, nothing that is codified in that sense. Any data that does come in, we are certain that we need to make acknowledgements to the origins of that data, and that, you know, if there's any discrepancies, that, yeah, like I said before, the developers of that data need to be contacted, and there needs to be accorded all there. And then what does this system look like for, you know, for our people? How does it empower them? Can it further aspirations? And I see, you know, personally, these are all my personal partai and whakaaro, by the way. I said it at the start, but I see eco-index being highly advantageous for haukainga. I think, you know, we have a system inclusive of so much data collated across institutes, which in itself is just huge mahi, to be able to, you know, reach, to develop our taiao through ecological enhancement, and it gives us that picture. I think GIS, or, you know, data can be in all its forms, can be such a powerful tool. And yeah, I think haukainga can adapt this system, one way through GIS capabilities, overlaying their tikanga as a framework, which there's other work that is in those sort of in and around these spaces, which can be tied in there. Next slide, please. And yeah, he whakawhitiwhiti kōrerorero. So, this is sort of where I ask if there's any questions, but really I'm imploring everyone here now to be able to think and maybe talk to what their thoughts are. And that's fine if we don't, we'll just kick off early, I guess. But, we understand as our eco-index rōpū, within our whānau that we have a lot of growth to undertake within this kaupapa of Māori Data Sovereignty, and absolutely open to these suggestions so that we actively want to contribute in a positive way as a program. So what is data in an eco-index context? What could it be? What should it include or exclude? Like I mentioned before, any mātauranga, is that even appropriate? Does anyone have any additional thoughts? And does anyone know any similar projects where they're enacting some really good tikanga on Māori data sovereignty? Te Whata is just one that I could think of. What are they up to? So kia ora, I just like to thank everyone again for listening, and Catherine for her tautoko, and the rest of our team, Olivia and Kitty, for jumping on, and invite anyone to share their thoughts.
Kia ora kōrua. I was going to say, is that a hand up? No, that's a clap. A clap from Kitty. Okay, thanks, Kitty. So thanks very much for sharing that, and it's really interesting to see how it's all been laid out. Certainly open for any questions or comments if people have them. Generally about eco. Sandy?
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Corey, this is a question apartheid for you. What about the term biocultural measures? If you're speaking about like a tangata whenua and you're wanting to do like Māori sovereignty, especially if you want to keep those pūrākau, te reo, kōrero tuku iho locked down, what about something with the eco-index is just like a tick box? Like, yes, there's kōrero tuku iho here. Yes, there's taonga species. But as far as like breaking it all down, that's where you have to go and knock on a marae door or a runanga door or a kaumātua's door.
Do you mean breaking it all down, like looking at the data and fleshing it out into those categories?
Yeah, like with the eco-index, when you like suggest go and restore those particular areas because there's a site of significance, a wāhi tapu, a pūrākau, mōtiatia, all those things, like the eco-index wouldn't actually hold that mātauranga. Like you guys wouldn't even collect it. And then you'd just be hands-free, and then you'd just redirect it to the iwi or hapu or marae.
Yep, absolutely. Ideally, that's the way it would go. It would just be the iwi would be able to input and shape their values within an index, and then just slap that on top of, and it would be able to change those numbers, potentially change those places of priority, potentially, or everything might align with them. But I don't think that we should need to hold any kōrero tapu or anything like that.
I might just add to that. I mean, I think so. First of all, kia ora, ko kiri toko ingoa. I'm co-lead of the Eco Index, and Corey, I learned from you today. Thank you for your kōrero. My thought is that you can think of the Eco Index maybe like a pocket knife. That's how I've come to think of it sometimes. Like, you choose, we can give the pocket knife to somebody and they can choose all the different tools on it, which one they want the most to use, which maybe several, and then what job they want it for. And I think what you said, Sandy, is right on the money, that hopefully we can provide this information and then it's applied in the way that fits the tikanga of that iwi, that hapu, with the knowledge that they have around their space.
I can sort of add in here. I think there's it's really interesting because I think in the conversations around, Māori Data Sovereignty, you get into these conversations actually around sovereignty, and the same with, when we think about data governance, and the sort of like the relationship, but the difference between the data governance and the governance itself. And so, I think sometimes we're wanting to ensure that the governance relationships or the treaty relationship is in place in the right sort of way between entities. And if that's the case, then it doesn't matter what's happening with the data, that there'll be the right process around how decisions get made about what happens. But because we're not comfortable with that, or from history and from maybe kind of current sort of situations, we then start thinking about using the data part as as sort of like the vehicle for trying to make sure that the other part doesn't happen. I think that's a kind of an interesting one here, where you're getting essentially a lot of the data sets that are coming in are from kind of national places. They're showing you sort of everything in an area, which also includes the area that might be relevant to a particular hapu or a particular iwi. They haven't provided the data. There's additional information they could provide that would give context to that too. And so you've got these sort of two bits. One bit about to what degree are they comfortable putting information in there in any sort of format to make their interest in those spaces known. And then to what degree might they be able to say, actually, we're uncomfortable with what's been kind of represented across that space. And I'm not sure where that will get to. I'm guessing that most of the places where you've developed those sort of maps that Catherine sort of mocked up, is that sort of process around areas for restoration would be done alongside, or does that become something, is that done alongside sort of mana whenua, or is that something that is just the best, your kind of best guess based on what you know from a sort of a biodiversity point of view? Sorry, there are a few things in there, but I guess there's a question at the end.
I think I heard a bit that I can answer. So just with respect to how you can figure out what it looks like for shaping out an area alongside mana whenua, I've been doing that for Te Aroa. And what I did was I looked at catchment scales that feed into or out from Te Aroa, and I've gone bigger outside of what our general rohe is, so that we can have an idea of what's actually feeding into our rohe as well. So it is looking at that broader approach. That's what I've done for our people, but I couldn't speak on if that's the way that it should be done with others. But this being, I guess, piloting on how this could work for Hokainga potentially. I think it for me, it was something that I was capable of because I have a little bit of GIS knowledge. For others, that's where that upskilling needs to happen if they wanted to be able to have that self-determination of defining where their area is. But in terms of why catchments in the first place, I'll leave that to the ecologist to answer. Kia ora.
I can tackle that one. Oh, you could tackle it, Catherine.
There you go.
Okay. Well, you add what you think, or change what you think. But yeah, it's a tricky one knowing this is to your question, Maui, about the where that we are recommending. We're not recommending anywhere in particular. We're going to recommend, here's a space, and then here's a bunch of boxes that you can tick for the information that we know about, like ecologically speaking, here's where it would be a good place to restore because it connects up to existing bits of Ngāhere. Or here's a good place because actually hardly any of this kind of ecosystem is left on that part of the landscape. So maybe that would be a place to think about putting some of it back of that type with all the animals and plants that live in it. And so that way, the person who knows most about that space, it's their space, they choose which of those priorities they want and include their own priorities too, where they have knowledge of what's in their space that they want to prioritize as well. Open to ideas, though, that's kind of where we've gotten to with leaving it as optional as possible, like giving the information, but like letting the power of decision be it's not us, it's not our mana to have to do that.
So it's essentially like a decision support, give you some information which you can then kind of take into context. I guess that, was the, I know in sort of in the testing, as Corey's talked about, you're specifically working alongside groups. Once the tool is in place, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that the user of the tool are using a similar process. I mean, people could, hāpori, we could kind of look at themselves and apply it themselves, but also could be applied independently by other groups as well.
Yeah, because we, of course, are thinking that our money isn't going to last into infinity, unfortunately. So we can't work with everyone to sort out what they want for them, because we'll be gone. So what the legacy that we leave behind, we want it to be something that is, flexible. And so people can take what is useful from it and then add that to their own mātauranga about their space. Did I miss anything, Catherine? Olivia?
No, just reiterating that, it's an information service, and that also means there's no regulatory arm of the team or anything like that, and people can identify their own priorities, whether it's an information or data set that we have available, or if it's bringing their own information and data or mātauranga to the picture to help weigh up, okay, I think this is what's being recommended here, but I know that that's not appropriate, so we'll go with the other recommendation next door to it in terms of where to replant or restore the Ngāhere.
Nice. Any other pātai thoughts? I got lots, so I'll just keep going, but I'll leaving some space.
Oh, yeah, I've got another pātai. When do you guys think like community groups or groups that are wanting to do restoration should actually interact with the eco index? Is it straight off the bat, or once they've got an idea, or?
That's an awesome question. I would like to see it being useful at any stage of restoration, if you like, project. So in the planning, in terms of understanding what used to be across the whenua that you might be looking at, we've had a little bit of a response from some of the groups we've engaged with who went, I didn't know there was that much rimu. We need to grow more rimu. So like that's really early stage planning, but also then say you've been successful in a funding application and you have to do the tedious report at the end to say, yes, we've spent the money here and yes, we planted this many trees. Perhaps the Eco Index Information Service can spit out some outputs that show through the artificial intelligence remote sensing that, clearly through this independent info source, we can show that we've planted this whole area up through this valley or whatever you like. So I think there's application. If we can achieve everything we're planning to, there's application for Eco Index services at every stage of a project. That's just two examples.
It could help too with the other end of the funding too. I think a few people I've talked with have said, well, this would be cool if we can point to your tool that says these are the areas that would be maybe good for restoring for these various reasons that we like. If you put that into a funding application, that can help give it a bit more I guess, scientific support, if you will, if that's the sort of funder that you're applying to. So, yeah, I agree with Catherine, really, any stage along the journey, we hope we can help. Monitoring too, I'm a monitoring maniac, so I'm always like, learn from what you do, learn from it, look back and look at it.
Hey, any other thoughts, questions? I did want to say, Corey, I kind of really appreciated the way you sort of worked through all the kind of the slides and sort of outlined a kind of a whole bunch of sorts of issues and challenges which you and the team have given some thought to. But that was kind of probably quite a nice way for other people that might be watching this too to be thinking about in the context of other projects. I think there hasn't, or there hadn't to, I don't think to date there's been lots of thoughts around sort of environmental data and how Māori Data Sovereignty sort of applies in that space. I know we did something last year that was starting to, start some conversations because, people are bringing it up in this context a lot more. And I think that there's, certainly as you're sort of thinking about, where the authority sits and what the nature of that authority might be in terms of kind of the data itself, whether it could be censored, whether it could be removed, some of these more kind of functional, sort of the functional elements as it relates to kind of the system, I think is sort of important. Like there's a sort of the two bits around really how can groups access it and use it for their purposes, and is it can it be put together in the right sort of way and applied alongside mātauranga and other things, but then that sort of role they might have in putting in place sort of limitations. I was kind of talking about that as data governance or access or some other sort of layer of involvement in that place. I think that's kind of an interesting one as you try and think about those groups at different scales as well, and what you can and what you should acknowledge in terms of sort of authority at those, at a whānau level or hāpori level or sort of an iwi space as well. So that was, I just really appreciated the way you thought about that, and some of the different things you'd highlighted too around, how you check the quality of the data or kind of put in place processes that allow it to be corrected or censored or, whatever the thing is that then makes it more sort of useful and usable for users too. So just wanted to mention that.
I just referred back to Corey's prompts. Does anyone know, are there any other programs similar to ours and what they might be up to that they'd like to bring to the table? And then maybe I'll stop sharing after, because I think we've covered a lot of those awesome points you put out.
So there's involved in a sort of a project with some colleagues in the States that are actually looking around a lot of sort of environmentally related data sets. But that's more trying to think about sort of the application of the FAIR principles and the CARE principles and then the trust principles. And so the FAIR principles just support sort of open data, and it's, I think it's essentially all of it's about how do you make more data more publicly available, and then also how do you deal with the I guess the rights elements, making sure kind of data is has got Creative Commons licenses, that it's been kind of released formally into public domains. And I think it feels to me that a lot of that sort of work is also about enabling AI tools to make use of that data, without creating any kind of liability in the kind of activities that they're involved in. So that's sort of kind of a path. There's certainly, I think, interest around and support for the CARE principles around Indigenous data governance. But there's still a little bit kind of early in the piece around what that looks like in practice. And so there's some of the work that's happening with that group is trying to identify what kinds of criteria might apply in the same way as criteria indicators being put in place for the FAIR principles. And similarly for the trust principles, which are a bit more about how repositories should be acting in a responsible and trustworthy manner. So I think there's that sort of stuff. Also, having some conversations about what sorts of how do you create enabling metadata schema within kind of systems, so that you've got space for the indigenous data or indigenous metadata. And I think there's a little bit of thinking about that. We at the recent e-research conference, we had a session trying to think about what Māori metadata might be kind of relevant to things that people are doing. So what sorts of things do you need to collect, both in terms of content? So, when Corey, I think, talked a little bit about, different sorts of qualitative content or pūrākau or waiata, things like that, that at least there's space within systems should people decide that that's the sort of information they're comfortable sharing. And I think there's a bit of a jump to that, but if they get to the point they're comfortable sharing that can be incorporated. And then maybe alongside, when those sorts of things are shared, that there's the appropriate sorts of either protocols or permissions or kind of provenance sort of connects that are made to that information as well. So I think there is we're going to have a indigenous metadata discussion, and maybe you guys might like to join it. So we can follow up with us around that at some point.
Kapai. Yeah, that sounds cool.
Any other whakaaro people want to share?
I just had one other thought that came to mind when Corey was talking about where the data is stored. So like just stuff like servers, which I don't understand a lot of it. So take this all with a grain of salt. But that new Amazon server in Auckland, from what I remember, maybe it's something to be thought about a bit, because I think it will still be owned by the US because Amazon's a US registered company. And so therefore there are some laws that will apply to the contents of that server that are within the jurisdiction of the United States. So even when there's a server physically on the soil of Aotearoa, it may be that what's in it is going to be legally subject to another country's laws. So it's a really hairy area. This is not my knowledge. This is from Chris Cormack at Catalyst Cloud when he came to speak to our team. I think that's what he said. Tricky.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, and it's probably a bit of an interaction between the laws of the particular country where the servers sit, and then the laws that sit in other places. So when they're having these sort of conversations internationally around that, and particularly with the sort of American company servers in in Russia, that they had said that actually this is seen to be the home of the data, even if the data shifts around across a kind of a sort of an international network, and then becomes subject to those laws. But it will depend on what the law, what's the law here, and how it impacts on any kind of sorts of laws that might be sitting at the other end in terms of company responsibilities. So I think in the first instance, the idea about things being onshore was just a pretty sort of generic statement about sort of maintaining control. But then I think, the control sort of exists over more, there's more elements to how that ends up being done in practice than just the server being here. So I think that legislative component is important. I think Corey mentioned as well, the security of the data is important. And then of course, any sorts of kind of governance kind of frameworks that get put in place around it, because it starts to, there's one question about how the data is sort of protected. And then there's another bit around how it gets used. And I think there's, increasingly we're having to think a little bit more about the use end of it and what sorts of things need to be put in place to guide that aspect as more options come into play around kind of the storage end.
Are you thinking of things like encryption?
I don't know. I think because I'm guessing it's not so much about that as I think those things end up still being sort of security kind of elements, but we start thinking probably less about where the data is and how it's being used and what sorts of tools and things can be applied to it. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is, how do you start talking more about sort of like the Māori digital sovereignty elements rather than the data sovereignty elements, which then tend to get a bit more of a focus on, who's got control on where it is, rather than what's being done with it, and how that gets applied. So it's sort of a pathway to that, but I think there's a whole set of different sorts of conversations you get into when you start thinking about how it should be used for benefit, or how it can be used in different ways, and what sorts of AI tools get put in place, and whether those tools can reflect Māori logics and other things.
Good questions, yeah.
Cool. Oh well, it looks like we are getting to the top of the hour, and no one has got their hand up with burning questions, so I'll just take the chance to say thank you. Thanks very much to Catherine and Corey, ngā mihi kōrerorero, o tira te rōpū rangi hau whānui, so all the other members of Eco Index that have joined us today, and everyone else that's been able to make time today to join in and listen to this Whāki webinar. So just hei whakakapi ngā kōrero mo tēnei ahi ki tau ki tātou katoa, te atawhātua tātou ariki, kraiti, te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga teitanga ki te wairo tapu ake. Āmene.
Amen. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora.
Thanks,
Kia
Maui.
ora.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you, everyone. Kia ora tātou.
Ngā mihi.